Picture a medieval town square, if you're imagining iron maidens, racks creaking under screaming victims, and hooded executioners in candle-lit dungeons. Congratulations, you've been watching too many movies. The reality of medieval justice was far more mundane, more bureaucratic, and in some ways, more disturbing precisely because of how ordinary it was. Most people in medieval Europe would never see the inside of a torture chamber. But they'd absolutely see the stocks. They'd witness the pillory. They'd walk past the town square every single day and be reminded exactly what happened when you stepped out of line. Medieval punishment wasn't hidden in dark dungeons, it was performed on a stage, and the entire community had front row seats. To understand medieval legal procedures, we need to abandon our modern assumptions about justice systems. This wasn't about rehabilitation. It wasn't even primarily about punishment in the way we understand it. Medieval justice served three fundamental purposes: extracting what authorities believed to be truth, enforcing rigid social hierarchies, and creating public deterrence through fear. The medieval legal mind operated on a simple principle: visible punishment prevented invisible crime. If your neighbor saw what happened to someone who stole bread, you wouldn't steal bread. If the entire town watched a merchant publicly humiliated for selling watered-down ale, other merchants would think twice. The system was designed to make examples of people, to transform individual wrongdoers into living warnings. This public nature of punishment reveals something crucial about medieval society. Justice wasn't a private matter between criminal and state. It was a communal ritual, a shared experience that reinforced social bonds and hierarchies. When you stood in that town square watching someone in the stocks, you weren't just observing punishment, you were participating in it. Let's start with the most common punishment device in medieval Europe: the stocks and pillory. These weren't instruments of torture in any conventional sense. They were tools of humiliation, and they were everywhere. The stocks restrained a person's ankles and wrists while they sat on the ground. The pillory locked the head and hands while the person stood. Both placed the offender at exactly the right height for public interaction, and that interaction was the entire point. These devices were used for minor crimes: drunkenness, petty theft, fraudulent business practices, or public disturbances. Here's what made them effective: they were boring. A person might spend 6 hours, 12 hours, sometimes multiple days locked in the stocks in the center of town. No dramatic torture, just endless exposure. The physical discomfort was real: muscles cramping, joints aching, the inability to relieve yourself. But the psychological punishment was worse. Your neighbors would see you. Your customers would see you. Your children would see you. People you'd known your entire life would walk past, and some would stop to throw rotten vegetables, spit, or shout insults. Others would simply stare. The medieval community was small and tight-knit, which meant your reputation was everything. The stocks didn't just punish your body, they destroyed your social standing. Merchants caught selling substandard goods faced particularly creative additions. Bakers who sold underweight loaves might have the offending bread hung around their necks while locked in the pillory. Brewers who watered down ale might have the bad beer poured over their heads. The punishment fit the crime in a way designed for maximum public education. This is what happens when you cheat your community. If you want to understand how medieval punishment reflected social hierarchies, look no further than the scold's bridle, also called the brank or gossip's bridle. This device was an iron cage that fit over a woman's head, with a metal plate or spike that pressed down on the tongue, making speech painful or impossible. The scold's bridle reveals the gendered nature of medieval justice. Men convicted of slander or verbal offenses might face fines or the pillory. Women accused of being scolds, which could mean anything from actual slander to simply talking back to their husbands or male neighbors, were subjected to this specifically designed humiliation. The woman would be paraded through town wearing the bridle, unable to speak, reduced to a spectacle of female disobedience tamed. Sometimes she'd be chained to a post in the market square for hours. The message was unmistakable. Women who didn't control their tongues would have them controlled for them. This wasn't state-level justice. These devices were often owned by local parishes or municipalities and deployed for localized social control. A woman didn't need to commit a crime in any legal sense, she just needed to annoy the wrong people. The scold's bridle functioned, a tool for enforcing community standards about proper feminine behavior, and its use continued in some places into the 18th century. Understanding these public punishments requires understanding a fundamental shift in medieval legal thinking. Early medieval Europe relied heavily on trial by ordeal, the belief that God would directly intervene to prove guilt or innocence. You'd carry hot iron, or be submerged in water, and divine judgment would make the truth known. But as secular legal systems developed and the Church became increasingly uncomfortable with trial by ordeal, a problem emerged. How do you determine truth without God's direct intervention? The answer, increasingly, was confession. If you could make someone confess, you had your truth or at least a legally satisfactory substitute for it. This created the legal framework that justified what we now call judicial torture. It wasn't sadism for its own sake. It was a systematic attempt to extract sworn testimony that courts would accept as evidence. The public punishments we've discussed were one part of this system. But for more serious crimes, authorities needed more intensive methods of truth extraction. Which brings us to the devices of legend. Now we arrive at the moment you've probably been waiting for, the famous torture devices. The rack, the Iron Maiden, the instruments that appear in every medieval horror movie and haunted house. Here's the problem. Most of what you think you know about these devices is wrong. Not exaggerated fundamentally, historically wrong. The medieval torture chamber, as you imagine it, is largely a myth, popularized by 19th century sensationalist literature, romanticized Gothic horror, and museum exhibits designed to shock and attract paying customers. Let's separate the historical reality from the profitable fiction. The rack actually existed, and it functioned basically as depicted, a wooden frame with rollers at each end, ropes attached to the prisoner's wrists and ankles, with the mechanism gradually stretching the body to extract confessions. But here's what the movies don't show you: the paperwork. In most medieval and early modern jurisdictions that used the rack, its application was heavily regulated. Court officials had to be present. Physicians often attended to ensure the prisoner didn't die before confessing. Records were meticulously kept. Why? Because even medieval courts understood a fundamental problem. Confessions obtained under extreme duress were unreliable. People will say anything to make pain stop. This made torture-extracted confessions legally problematic. Many jurisdictions required corroborating evidence before a confession obtained through torture could lead to conviction. The rack was typically employed in cases of treason, heresy, or high-profile political crimes, situations where the state had specific information it believed the prisoner possessed. It was a tool of state power, not random cruelty. This doesn't make it any less horrific, but it does make it less common than popular imagination suggests. Moreover, the rack was expensive and required a dedicated space and trained operators. Most local jurisdictions couldn't afford such infrastructure. For every prisoner who faced the rack, thousands more faced simpler, more brutal punishments: flogging, branding, mutilation, or execution. The spectacular devices weren't the norm, they were the exception. And now we come to perhaps the most famous torture device in history, the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, an upright sarcophagus covered in spikes. The victim, sealed inside, would be slowly pierced by dozens of iron points, positioned to avoid vital organs, ensuring hours of agony before death. Except it's a complete fabrication. The famous Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, now housed in various museums, was constructed in the late 18th or early 19th century, assembled from various medieval pieces and marketed to sensationalist exhibitions as an authentic medieval torture device. There are no medieval records describing its use, no contemporary accounts, no legal documents mentioning it. What we have instead is a 19th century obsession with Gothic medievalism. The Romantic era loved the idea of the Dark Ages, barbaric, superstitious, violent. Entrepreneurs created exhibits featuring authentic medieval torture instruments, many of which were either entirely fabricated or dramatically modified from their actual historical function. The Iron Maiden became iconic precisely because it's visually striking and conceptually horrifying. It represents our worst fears about medieval injustice in one compact, photogenic package. But it tells us more about 19th century attitudes toward the Middle Ages than about actual medieval practices. This matters because the Iron Maiden appears in countless documentaries, textbooks, and museums as evidence of medieval barbarity. It's been used to argue that the medieval period was uniquely cruel, that the Enlightenment saved us from darkness. But you can't build historical understanding on fraudulent evidence. The Judas cradle presents a different problem. This pyramid-shaped seat, where the victim would allegedly be slowly lowered onto the point, appears in various historical texts, but always from later periods, describing earlier times. Medieval documentation for this specific device is essentially non-existent. The earliest reliable references come from the Renaissance and Reformation periods, often in polemical literature designed to portray religious or political enemies as barbaric. Protestant writers describe Catholic inquisitions using such devices. Catholic writers attributed them to Protestant heretics. Each side was eager to portray the other as monstrous. This suggests the Judas cradle might fall into a category of exaggerated or mythologized punishments methods that perhaps existed in isolated instances, but were amplified in historical memory to serve ideological purposes. When you're trying to convince people that your enemies are evil, describing their torture methods in elaborate detail is remarkably effective propaganda. The truth is likely more mundane and more disturbing. The worst cruelties of medieval justice were in exotic devices. They were common, everyday brutalities, public floggings that stripped flesh from bone, branding irons that marked criminals permanently, mutilations cutting off ears, hands, or tongues that left people alive but destroyed their ability to function in society. These punishments don't make good museum exhibits. They're not visually interesting. You can't reconstruct them as creepy props. But they were far more common than any elaborate torture device, and their victims numbered in the hundreds of thousands. So what do we do with this information? How do we think about medieval justice now that we've separated myth from history? First, we recognize that the medieval torture chamber is largely a later invention, created by people who wanted to make the past seem more barbaric than their own enlightened present. This doesn't mean medieval justice was kind. It was brutal, public, and designed to terrify. But it was brutal in ordinary ways, through ordinary violence, not through elaborate engineering. Second, we understand that the most effective medieval punishments weren't physical at all, they were social. The stocks and pillory destroyed reputations. The scold's bridle enforced gender hierarchies. Public executions created spectacles that bound communities together through shared fear. Medieval people understood something we often forget. Social death can be worse than physical death. Third, we acknowledge that our fascination with medieval torture devices reveals our own fears and obsessions. We've turned historical violence into entertainment, into museum exhibits and horror movies. In doing so, we've created a comfortable distance between barbaric them and civilized us. But scratch the surface of modern justice systems, and you'll find echoes everywhere. Public shaming on social media, lengthy pretrial detentions, plea bargains extracted through the threat of disproportionate punishment. We've traded the pillory for the Twitter mob and the rack for solitary confinement. The tools change. The fundamental dynamic using fear and pain to extract compliance and maintain social order remains remarkably consistent. Medieval justice wasn't uniquely evil. It was human. And that might be the most uncomfortable truth of all. If this historical deep dive challenged what you thought you knew, hit subscribe for more evidence-based history that separates fact from fiction. Drop a comment with the historical myth you'd most like to see debunked next. And remember, the darkest parts of history aren't always where we expect to find them.